No vampire king would ever choose you, her stepmother said. Not loudly. Never loudly. Lady Morwen Blackthorn had no need for volume. She said it the way one comments on a dying arrangement of flowers, with mild, unhurried disappointment, while fastening Seraphine's jeweled collar and watching herself in the mirror, and not once turning to look at Lyra directly. Women who say such things rarely do. Lyra did not reply. She had learned, somewhere between her father's funeral and her 14th year of carrying trays through halls that had once been her inheritance, that replies were simply more material. Silence was the one thing Lady Morwen could not reshape into a weapon. But her hands, pressed flat against the folds of her plain ivory dress, were not entirely still. She was 22 years old, the only surviving child of Lord Aldrich Ashbourne, who had died 4 years ago under circumstances that the official record described as a fever and that Lyra, in her quieter moments, had never quite believed. He had left behind a will so conveniently vague that it had given Lady Morwen everything she required and Lyra almost nothing. A small room in the East Wing, a trust with conditions attached so elaborate they functioned less like protection and more like a very elegant cage. And there was something else. Something Lyra had carried for 3 years now, hidden the way you hide a thing when you have nowhere safe to put it down. A secret about her mother, about what her mother had been, about the pendant at her throat, that her father, in his last coherent hour, had pressed into her hands and said, "Never remove this, whatever they tell you, whatever happens, do not take it off." She had not removed it. She did not know why. She only knew that the weight of it against her sternum felt, on certain nights, less like jewelry and more like a warning from someone who was no longer alive to explain it. She was thinking about none of this when the sound reached her. Wheels on the courtyard stones, but not the light, familiar rattle of a merchant's cart or a lesser noble's hired carriage. This was something heavier, unhurried, the sound of something that had never needed to move quickly because everything made way for it. Lady Morwen stopped speaking mid-sentence. Lyra had never in 4 years seen Lady Morwen stop mid-sentence. Her stepmother turned toward the tall windows with an expression that traveled in the space of a single breath, from the particular satisfaction of a woman who has already decided how the evening ends, to something that looked very much like the first cold edge of fear. Lyra turned also. The crest on the carriage door was not something she needed to study. Everyone in Nocturus knew it. It had hung above palace gates and been stamped into royal decrees and whispered about in servants' quarters for 500 years. The crest of House Draven. The vampire king had arrived. Lady Morwen said nothing. For the first time in 4 years, she said absolutely nothing at all. And Lyra, whose hands had not been entirely still 30 seconds ago, felt something shift very quietly in the space beneath her ribs. Not triumph. She did not allow herself triumph yet, but something. The first faint suggestion that the ground beneath Blackthorn Palace was not as solid as anyone had been permitted to believe. She did not yet know why he had come. She did not yet know what it would require of her when she found out. But she was about to discover that some things, when they arrive at the precise wrong moment, are indistinguishable from the moment everything finally begins. The doors opened. King Caelan Draven did not enter the way powerful men perform entrances. He simply walked in, and the room became a different room because he was in it. White hair, a crown worn like it was simply part of his skull. Dark eyes that moved across every face in the ballroom with the particular unhurried patience of a man who has been waiting for something for 5 centuries and has learned not to mistake approximations for the real thing. Lady Morwen stepped forward, Seraphine's gloved hand in hers, chin lifted, smile arranged. The king's gaze moved past her, past Seraphine, past every duchess in pearls, every countess in silk, every daughter of every noble house who had spent 3 weeks preparing for this exact moment. He stopped. He stopped where Lyra was standing, near the back, near the servants. in the place she had taught herself to occupy so completely that most people looked through her as though she were a feature of the architecture. He did not look through her. He looked at her the way you look at something you have been searching for long enough that recognition, when it finally comes, feels less like surprise and more like the end of a very long-held breath. And then, in front of every noble family in Nocturus, in front of the stepmother who had spent 4 years telling her she was nothing in front of Seraphine, whose expression had gone entirely still, the immortal vampire king lowered himself onto one knee. The ballroom did not gasp. It simply stopped. "I have searched 500 years," Kaelin said quietly, "for the last daughter of the Crimson Throne." He looked up at her. "Will you become my queen?" Lady Morwen's hand, still holding Seraphine's, went slack. Lyra's pendant, the one her father had made her swear never to remove, began to glow. She did not know, standing in the wreckage of everything Lady Morwen had built, that the answer to that question had been decided long before she was born. She did not know yet what it would cost her to claim it, but somewhere beneath the palace, in chambers sealed for 300 years, something ancient was beginning to wake, and it already knew her name. She has spent 4 years being told she is nothing. He has spent 500 years searching for something. They are about to be in the same room. Stay with me, because what happens next in that ballroom is the moment Lady Morwen's entire world begins to collapse, and I promise you, it is worth every second of the wait. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps more people find it. And if you want to be here when the next chapter drops, subscribe and turn on notifications because this story moves fast and I don't want you missing what's coming. Now, the doors are opening. The king has entered the building. Let's go. The ballroom had been built to impress kings. Lyra had always understood this in the abstract. The vaulted ceilings, the tiered chandeliers dripping with 1,000 candles. The marble floor polished until it held the reflection of every gown and jewel above it, like a second, more honest world below. Blackthorn Palace had been designed so that whoever entered it would feel, immediately and completely, that they had arrived somewhere that mattered. It had not been designed for a man who made the room feel small simply by existing in it. Kaelin Draven walked in, and the 1,000 candles seemed to dim, not visibly, not in any way that could be pointed to or explained afterward, but something in the quality of the light shifted, the way it shifts before a storm, the world not yet dark, but the brightness suddenly revealed as thin. He wore black, unadorned except for the crown, and he did not look at the chandeliers or the marble or the banners bearing House Blackthorn's crest. He looked at the people, one face at a time, with the patient and unhurried attention of a man conducting a search he had long since stopped expecting to finish quickly. The room was silent in the way that only rooms full of people can be silent, every breath held, every silk skirt stilled, every prepared smile fixed in place and slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to feel uncertain of itself. Lady Morwen did not allow uncertainty. She stepped forward with Seraphine's hand resting on her arm. The two of them arranged with the precise elegance of a portrait commissioned to make a point. Seraphine was dressed in deep sapphire, her dark hair pinned with rubies, her expression composed into the particular becoming modesty of a woman who has rehearsed it until it feels like a natural expression. She was, by every measure Nocturus recognized, exactly what a queen was supposed to look like. Lady Morwen's smile was the smile of someone who has already won. The king's gaze moved across them both, and continued. The silence changed texture. It became the silence of people who have witnessed something they do not yet have language for. He walked past Seraphine, past the Duchess of Evenmere, who had traveled 3 days, past the Countess of Aldrath, whose bloodline predated the kingdom by 2 centuries. Past every daughter of every family who had spent the past month making themselves into something worth choosing. He moved through the ballroom the way water moves, not unkindly, not with any visible disdain, simply with the complete and terrible certainty of something that knows where it is going. Lyra, was standing near the far edge of the room. She had positioned herself there deliberately, as she always did, close enough to the servants' corridor that she could be useful if something was needed, far enough from the center that no one's gaze would find her accidentally. She had perfected the particular stillness of someone who has learned to exist in a room without occupying it. She was watching the king the way one watches a fire, aware of it, cautious of it, certain that it had nothing to do with her. She became aware by degrees that the distance between them was shrinking. She did not move. She was not certain her legs would have obeyed her if she had tried. He stopped, 2 feet away, close enough that she could see his eyes, which were darker than she had expected and older, not in the way of a man who has aged, but in the way of someone who has watched everything she had ever been taught to believe was permanent, come apart and reform and come apart again, and arrived somewhere on the other side of it that she did not have a name for. He looked at her the way she had sometimes looked at her father's old letters, like something recognized, and then he lowered himself onto one knee. The ballroom made a sound. It was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. It was the sound of 200 people's understanding of how the world worked cracking cleanly down the middle. Lady Morwen's composed expression did something she would never afterward admit to. Her hand resting on Seraphine's arm tightened until Seraphine made a small involuntary sound that no one heard because every person in the room was looking at Lyra. "I've searched 500 years," Kaelin said, "for the last daughter of the Crimson Throne." His voice was quiet. It carried anyway into every corner, into every carefully arranged future that had just been unmade. He looked up at her. "Will you become my queen?" Lyra's pendant burned against her sternum, not painfully, but with the sudden insistent warmth of something waking. She pressed her hand to it without meaning to. She could not speak. She could not move. She was 22 years old, and she had spent the last 4 years learning to take up as little space as possible. And a man who had ruled for 5 centuries was kneeling on the marble floor of her stepmother's palace and saying her name like it meant something, like it had always meant something. Behind her, she heard the sound of Lady Morwen's breath leaving her body in one long, involuntary exhale. The prophecy, it seemed, had not consulted anyone's plans. She did not go willingly exactly, but she did not refuse. Those were 2 different things, and Lyra had enough practice with difficult situations to understand the distinction. Refusal required certainty, and she had none. What she had was a pendant that had burned against her skin for the first time in 22 years, a room full of witnesses, and a king who was still waiting for her answer with the patience of someone who had already waited 5 centuries and considered a few more minutes entirely reasonable. She had said finally, "The only honest thing available to her, I don't understand." Kaelin had looked at her as though this was, somehow, the most correct response she could have given. "You will," he said. "Come." His palace was 3 hours north of Blackthorn and nothing like it. Where Blackthorn had been built to impress, this place had been built to endure. The stone was older, darker, worn smooth in the places where centuries of hands had passed. The corridors did not echo with the particular hollow grandeur of rooms designed for display. They were quiet in the way that libraries are quiet, full rather than empty. Lyra noticed, in the carriage and again on arrival, that she kept waiting to feel afraid and finding instead a strange, low-level recognition she could not account for, as though some part of her had been here before and simply hadn't told the rest of her about it. She was shown to study. Kaelin was already there. He did not begin with the ceremony. He sat across from her and spoke the way people speak when they have rehearsed something so many times that the rehearsal has finally fallen away, leaving only the thing itself. He told her about the Crimson Dynasty. The first rulers of Noctharis, he said, were neither purely human nor purely vampire. They were something older, a bloodline that carried both, that had been the living agreement between 2 peoples who had every reason to destroy each other and had chosen for 300 years not to. The Crimson Queens had been the balance, not symbolic, literal. Their blood was the seal that held the peace intact. When the dynasty fell, through betrayal, through a war that history had been carefully rewritten to obscure, the last queen hid her daughter, changed her name, concealed every mark of what she was. The bloodline had not died. It had only gone underground, passing from mother to daughter, hidden inside ordinary lives, waiting. Waiting for what? Lyra said. For the moment the kingdom needed it again, Kaelin said. Which is now. She looked at her hands. She had the specific feeling of someone being told the explanation for something they have always half known and half refused to examine directly. She said, "You've made a mistake. I'm nobody. I carry trays. I arrange flowers." "I know," he said, and something in the way he said it, not dismissive, not unkind, simply accurate, stopped her next argument before she could make it. He asked her, then, to show him the pendant. She lifted it from her collar. It was small, deep red, faceted in a way she had never been able to identify as any known stone. In the lamplight of his study, it did not merely reflect the flame. It held it. Kaelin looked at it for a long moment without touching it. "It's been suppressing your aura for your entire life," he said, "hiding what you are from anyone who would recognize it. Your parents had it made. It was the only reason you survived." The silence that followed was the kind that required sitting inside rather than filling. "The birthmark," he said quietly, "above your heart." She went still. She had had it since birth. A small crimson mark, irregular, which her father had told her to keep covered and never discuss, and which she had spent 22 years treating as an embarrassing private fact. She had never shown it to anyone. She pressed her hand to it now without thinking. "It's the royal seal of the Crimson Dynasty," Kaelin said. "Only the true heir carries it. It cannot be forged. It cannot be transferred." At Blackthorn Palace, 3 hours south, Lady Morwen did not sleep. She moved through the locked east corridor with a candle, and the particular efficiency of a woman who has been dreading this night for years, and has therefore, in some detached and practical part of herself, been preparing for it. She knew which rooms. She had always known. The hidden correspondence. The portrait she had taken down 14 years ago and never destroyed because she had been certain, then, that she would never need to. The letters from Lyra's father that named the bloodline directly. She burned them all, methodically, without expression. She had known since before Lyra could walk. She had shaped every year since around the single objective of ensuring no one else ever found out. She fed the last letter to the flame and watched it go, and told herself it was not too late. In the morning, Kaelin watched Lyra thank the servant who brought her breakfast by name. Watched her notice, without being asked, that the young attendant by the door was trembling, new to the palace, visibly terrified, and crossed the room to speak quietly to her until the trembling stopped. He said nothing. He simply noted it, the way one notes a thing that confirms what one had already begun to suspect. The historian arrived at midday, old, precise, recommended by 3 separate sources for his knowledge of pre-dynastic Noctharis. He had asked to examine the pendant. He looked at it for less than 30 seconds. Then he looked at the birthmark. Then he sat down heavily in the nearest chair and looked at Lyra with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years studying a legend and has just discovered it sitting across from him drinking tea. "There is no doubt," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "None whatsoever." He looked at Kaelin. "She is the lost heir." The historian left his notes behind. Lyra did not read them immediately. She sat with them on the table in front of her for a long time, her tea cooling, the morning light moving across the stone floor in the slow and indifferent way of light that has no opinion about what is happening beneath it. The notes were precise, academic, written in the cramped hand of a man accustomed to recording facts rather than softening them. She read them eventually. Then she sat in the particular stillness of someone whose understanding of their own life has just been revised from the foundation upward. Kaelin did not rush her. This was something she was still adjusting to. the absence of pressure. 4 years of Lady Morwen had calibrated her to expect that silence was always prelude to something, that patience was a performance concealing an agenda. Kaylin's stillness felt different. It felt like a man who had learned, over 5 centuries, that most things worth waiting for could not be hurried and had stopped trying. He told her when she was ready that there were journals. They had been recovered from a sealed compartment in Blackthorn Palace's East Wing, not by Kaylin's men, but by one of his archivists who had spent 30 years cataloging documents the noble houses preferred to forget existed. The compartment had been behind a false wall in a room that official palace records described as a disused linen store. Someone had known exactly where to hide things and had trusted the fiction of ordinariness to protect them. It had worked for 4 years. It had not worked against an archivist who distrusted official records on principle. Kaylin set the journals in front of Lyra without a preamble. Her father's handwriting. She recognized it from old letters she had found and hidden, and carried with her the way you carry things when you have very little left, not because they are useful, but because they are proof that something was real. She read them across the course of an afternoon, and Kaylin stayed, and neither of them spoke much, which was the right decision. The journals said what she had half known and wholly refused to examine, that her mother, Alara, had been the last living descendant of the Crimson Dynasty's secondary line, that her parents had understood from the night of Lyra's birth what the birthmark meant, that they had constructed her ordinary life deliberately carefully as an act of protection rather than neglect. The pendant commissioned from a craftsman who died shortly afterward, her mother's family name buried in altered records. Every trace of the Crimson bloodline systematically removed from the Ashbourne family history. Her father had written in the journal's final entries that he believed they had been found out, that someone inside Blackthorn Palace had been asking questions that were too precise to be accidental, that he was making arrangements to move Lyra somewhere safer, and that if he did not have the chance to explain everything himself, he hoped she would one day understand that everything he had hidden from her had been hidden out of love and not shame. The final entry was dated 3 days before his death. Lyra closed the journal. She did not cry, precisely. She sat with her hand flat on the cover and breathed in the specific way of someone who has received a grief they had already been carrying without knowing its full weight, and is now simply allowing it to be what it is. He knew, she said. Yes, Kaylin said. And Lady Morwen? Knew before he did, Kaylin said. We believe she had her own sources. Someone in the dynasty's old network who recognized your mother's bloodline before your parents understood the danger. She had your father watch. When it became clear he was planning to move you, she acted. The word acted did its quiet, devastating work in the space between them. Lyra thought about 4 years of arranged helplessness, the will's convenient imprecision, the isolated room, the systematic replacement of her name in household address, so gradual she had almost stopped noticing. The portraits, she had always wondered about the portraits. Her mother's face had simply ceased to exist in Blackthorn Palace. Every image was gone, so thoroughly that Lyra had begun to doubt the clarity of her own memory. She destroyed them, Lyra said. Not a question. All of them. Altered the family records. Had Seraphine's name inserted into documents where yours belonged. She intended. He paused, with the care of someone choosing words that will land hard regardless of how carefully they are placed. She intended to present Seraphine as the Ashbourne heir, to place her beside me when I arrived, to claim the Crimson Throne through her daughter while you remained invisible in the East Wing. It was never personal, Lyra said slowly. No, Kaylin said. It was always political. You were not someone she hated. You were something she needed to bury. The distinction, she found, did not make it easier. It made it, in some ways, considerably worse. They spoke more after that, in the evenings. Carefully at first, then less so. He asked her questions no one had thought to ask before, what she had read, what she thought about, what she had wanted before wanting things had started to seem impractical. She answered honestly because dishonesty required more energy than she had, and because something about the way he listened made performance feel unnecessary. He told her once what 500 years of ruling alone had actually been. Not the power, but the specific exhaustion of making every decision in the complete absence of anyone who would tell him plainly when he was wrong. She recognized the exhaustion without being able to name it until he did. Trust, she was discovering, did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it accumulated in small, unremarkable increments, like light through a window you had stopped expecting to open. Deep beneath Nocturus, in chambers that predated the kingdom itself, something that had been dormant for 3 centuries registered the historian's words as though they had been spoken directly into the dark. She is the lost heir, the ancient seal, carved into bedrock by the first Crimson Queens as a lock against what lay below, had been weakening for years. Slowly, imperceptibly, in the way that things weaken when the power that made them has been absent from the world for too long. It had been waiting in its patient and terrible way for exactly this. The last daughter of the Crimson Throne had revealed herself. In the dark below Nocturus, something that had been sleeping for 300 years opened its eyes. The first sign was the birds. Lyra noticed them at dawn. Every bird in the palace courtyard rising at once, without sound, without the usual disorder of startled wings, simply lifting all together and not returning. She stood at the window and watched the sky empty and felt the pendant grow warm against her sternum for the second time. She had learned, by now, to pay attention to the pendant. Kaelin was already in the war room when she found him, standing over a map of Nocturus with 3 of his oldest advisors, none of whom looked as though they had slept. The map was marked in red border towns, she realized, village outposts, the places where vampires and humans lived in the closest proximity, where the peace was thinnest and required the most maintenance. All of them were burning. It had started in the eastern provinces, where a vampire lord had attacked a human settlement without provocation or warning, violating a treaty that had been held for 60 years. By the time messengers arrived, 3 more incidents had been reported. Different regions, different families, no apparent connection except the sudden and total collapse of agreements that had survived generations. "It isn't spontaneous," Kaelin said when Lyra asked. His voice had the particular flatness of controlled anger. "The timing is too precise. Someone is moving pieces." The name arrived by midday, carried by a historian far older than the one who had identified Lyra's birthmark. A man so ancient that Kaelin addressed him with a deference she had not seen him extend to anyone else. He came wrapped in traveling clothes with the expression of someone who had hoped never to be needed for this specific information and had prepared it anyway. The Shadow Regent, he said, was not a legend. He had been a real man once, the first Crimson Dynasty's chief advisor, brilliant and patient and consumed over decades of proximity to power, by the belief that he deserved it more than the queens he served. When the last Crimson Queen refused to name him co-ruler, he had not argued. He had simply begun, quietly and methodically, to dismantle everything she had built. He had taken decades. He had been thorough. The war that destroyed the dynasty had not started as a war. It had started as a series of misunderstandings between vampires and humans, each one small enough to dismiss, each one engineered. He had not died when the dynasty fell. Something in his pursuit of the Crimson Bloodline's power had changed him, stretched him beyond ordinary death into something the historian described with careful academic precision as a persistence of will so concentrated it had become indistinguishable from existence. He had been bound beneath Nocturus by the last surviving Crimson Queen, using the only power strong enough to hold him. The seal had held for 300 years. "The seal requires the bloodline to maintain it," the historian said. "When the last of the line concealed herself, it began to degrade." "He's been waiting," Kaelin said. "He's been more than waiting," the historian said. "Every division between vampires and humans in the last 3 centuries, every treaty that failed at the final moment, every noble house turned against its neighbors. He paused. Lady Morwen Blackthorn's ambitions did not originate entirely with Lady Morwen. The room was very quiet. He needed the air hidden, Kaelin said, to keep the seal weak. And now she is found, the historian said. So he has stopped being subtle. That evening, Kaelin told her the rest of it. They were on the eastern terrace, the kingdom spread below them in the early dark, and he spoke the way he had learned to speak with her, directly, without the diplomatic softening she had come to recognize as its own form of condescension. He told her about the prophecy. Not the version the noble houses knew, which was vague and flattering and largely invented. The real one, recorded by the first Crimson Queens in a language 3 people alive could still read. A king who chooses from ambition will shatter what remains. A king who chooses from hope will restore what was lost. He had read it at 19 at the beginning of what she now understood was a 500-year reign, and had understood immediately that the choice of a queen was not a political decision. It was a threshold. The wrong choice, made for power or alliance or convenience, would be the final thing, the last fracture. So you waited, she said. I refused, he said. Every alliance, every arrangement, every family who arrived with a daughter in a list of strategic advantages. A pause. I was not waiting for someone worthy of the throne. I was looking for evidence that hope was still a reasonable thing to have. She looked at him for a long moment. And now, he said, the kingdom is fracturing and the seal is breaking and you are here. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has held a weight alone for a very long time and can finally see the place where he might be allowed to set it down. So yes, I think hope was reasonable. Lyra sat with that for a long time after he went inside. She thought about Lady Morwen's voice. No vampire king would ever choose you, and noticed for the first time that it no longer landed the way it used to. It arrived and she examined it and found that it described nothing real. It never had. It had only described Lady Morwen's requirements, and Lady Morwen's requirements had never been a measure of anything except Lady Morwen's fear. Worth, she understood now, was not something that could be conferred by the right person's approval or revoked by the wrong person's contempt. It simply was, or it wasn't, and no amount of repetition changed the underlying fact. She had always been worth something. She had simply been surrounded for a long time by people who needed her not to know it. She found out about the throne the following morning. Not from Kaelin, from the throne itself. She had been walking the lower corridor. She had not been taken there. She had simply found it, following the pendant's warmth the way you follow a sound you cannot quite identify. When she turned a corner and stopped, the room was ancient. The walls were carved with symbols she recognized from the historian's notes. And at the far end, on a dais of dark stone, sat a throne the color of deep red, not decorative, not ceremonial, but alive in the way that very old things are alive, with the accumulated weight of everything that has ever depended on them. As she stepped through the doorway, it happened. From the stone, from the carvings, from somewhere beneath the floor itself, her name, not spoken, not heard exactly, but present, the way a word is present when it has been waiting in a room long enough to saturate the air. Lyra. The Crimson Throne knew her, and it was asking her to decide. She did not touch it. She stood in the threshold of that ancient room for a long time, the pendant warm against her sternum, her name still resonating in the stone like the last note of a bell that has not quite finished sounding. And she did not cross to the throne. She looked at it. It looked back, or did something that felt like looking, the way very old and very powerful things develop the quality of attention without possessing eyes. Then she turned and walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall until Kaelin knocked. She told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was one of his more significant qualities. It called you by name, he said. Yes, Then it began. He sat across from her, and she recognized his expression, careful, measuring, preparing to say something he had been deciding how to say for some time. The prophecy requires a willing claim. The throne cannot be taken. It cannot be inherited through force or politics or strategic marriage. The heir must choose it, openly, of their own will, or it remains sealed. And if I don't, Lyra said. Then the seal continues to break, he said. The shadow regent continues to move. The kingdom continues to fracture. He paused. And I continue to search, I suppose, except that there is no one left to find. She noted that he had listed the consequences without including himself in them as a reason. She noted this carefully and filed it. Lady Morwen arrived the following morning. Lyra learned of it from a servant who came to her door with the wide-eyed expression of someone delivering information they would prefer not to be responsible for. Her stepmother had traveled through the night, had presented herself at the palace gates with Seraphine beside her, and a solicitor's document she claimed established Seraphine's right to the Ashbourne name and, by extension, the Crimson succession. The document was, the solicitor Caitlin summoned confirmed within 20 minutes of fabrication. Competent work, years of preparation visible in the detail. But fabrication nonetheless, built on the altered records Lady Morwen had spent a decade constructing. Caitlin had her escorted to a receiving room and kept there, politely and implacably, while he decided what to do with her. Seraphine, it emerged, had not waited. No one was entirely certain how she had found the throne room. The palace was old, and its lower corridors were not mapped in any document available to guests. But Seraphine had always been determined, and determination without scruple covers a great deal of ground. 2 of Caitlin's guards found her there, standing before the dais, her hands on the armrests of the crimson throne. Her expression arranged into the specific certainty of a woman who has been told her whole life that wanting something hard enough is equivalent to deserving it. The throne had not harmed her. It was not a thing that harmed me. It simply did nothing. It sat beneath her hands like stone, inert, empty, indifferent, the way a door is indifferent to someone who does not have the key. Seraphine had stood there for some time before the guards arrived, Lyra was told, pressing her hands against the armrests with increasing urgency, as though the problem were one of pressure rather than blood. When Caitlin's guards spoke her name, she had turned with an expression that Lyra, hearing the account, found she could not feel satisfied by. It was not the face of a villain exposed. It was the face of someone who had been given, their entire life, a map that turned out to describe a country that didn't exist. Lyra found she had more sympathy for that than she expected. Caitlin came to her that evening alone, without advisors or historians or any of the formal apparatus that had surrounded most of their conversations about the throne. He sat across from her and was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone organizing not their words but their willingness to say them. "I need you to know something before you decide," he said. "Not as a king. As the person who has been watching you thank servants by name and sit with frightened attendants and carry 4 years of someone else's cruelty without letting it make you cruel." He looked at her steadily. "If you refuse the throne, I will not attempt to change your mind. I will not present you with the kingdom's suffering as an obligation, or use the prophecy as leverage, or suggest that your worth is contingent on what you choose here." A pause. "If you walk away from this, I walk away with you. The throne can find another answer. I am not willing to find another reason to keep looking." Lyra sat with that for a long moment. No one had ever offered her a choice, and meant it. Every choice she had been given in Lady Morwen's house had been a performance, options presented to create the illusion of agency while the outcome was predetermined. This was different. She could see, in the straightness of his attention and the complete absence of persuasion in his voice, that he had already accepted either answer, that he was not managing her toward a conclusion. He simply wanted to know what she wanted. She was not certain anyone had ever simply wanted to know what she wanted. She thought about the throne room, about her name in the stone, about her father's journals and her mother's hidden bloodline, and 4 years of arranged invisibility. She thought about Lady Morwen's voice, No vampire king would ever choose you, and realized with a clarity that felt less like revelation than like something long known finally being spoken aloud, that the statement had always been backwards. It had never been about whether Kaelin would choose her. It was about whether she would choose herself. "I'll do it," she said, "not because the prophecy requires it, not because the kingdom needs it." She looked at him. "Because I have spent 4 years allowing someone else to decide what I'm worth, and I don't intend to spend a fifth." Something moved in Kaelin's expression. Not surprising. Something quieter than that. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "At dawn." She did not make it to dawn. In the deep hours of the night, when the palace was at its most still, the stones beneath Knockfaris began to tremble. Not violently, not yet, but with a specific, patient vibration of something enormous shifting its weight. The seal had not merely weakened, it had broken. In the throne room below, the shadows thickened beyond what darkness alone could account for, pooling at the base of the dais with the deliberate concentration of something that had been planning its entrance for 300 years. The Shadow Regent had waited long enough. He had come for the throne, and he had come before she could claim it. She made her choice, not because destiny demanded it, not because a king asked her, but because after 4 years of someone else deciding her worth, Lyra finally decided it herself. And the moment she did, the thing that has been waiting 3 centuries in the dark beneath Nocturus chose exactly that moment to arrive. The final chapter is coming. The throne room. The battle. The truth Kaelin has been holding back. And the single line he says to her after it's all over that will make everything, every cruel word, every stolen portrait, every year in that East Wing, finally completely mean something. If this story has kept you up, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video so the algorithm actually shows it to people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the finale is the chapter this entire story was built for. She was always worthy. She's about to prove it. She heard the stones before she felt them. A low, continuous tremor moving through the palace floor, through the soles of her feet, through the pendant at her throat, which had stopped being warm and become something closer to urgent, a pull rather than a warmth, directional, insistent, the way a compass is insistent. It did not ask. It simply pointed. She was already moving when Kaelin appeared in the corridor, and something in the way he looked at her, not surprised, not afraid, only resolved, told her he had felt it too. "The throne room," she said. "Yes," he said. Together. The corridors had changed. Not structurally. The stone was the same, the carvings the same, but the shadows had thickened beyond anything torchlight should have permitted, pooling in the corners with a density that suggested intention rather than the simple absence of light. They moved at the edges of her vision, not quickly but with the particular patience of something that has learned to wait and has now decided waiting is finished. She heard them before she saw them, voices low and layered, speaking in a language she did not know and somehow partially understood, the way you understand things in dreams. Not the words, but the weight beneath them. Old words. Words that had been used to pull a dynasty apart from the inside, one careful fracture at a time. The throne room doors were open. What stood before the dais was not, precisely, a man. It had been one once. She could see the architecture of it, the remnant shape of someone who had chosen this, who had spent centuries becoming less human in pursuit of something that had required the sacrifice of everything human to approach. The Shadow Regent was tall and dark and very still, with the quality of stillness that belongs to things that have not needed to move for a very long time because everything has been coming to them. He turned when they entered. "The lost heir," he said. His voice had the sound of something recorded and played back at the wrong speed, almost right, and therefore worse than simply wrong. "You took longer than I expected." "We're here now," Kaelin said. What happened next, Lyra would never be able to describe in sequence because it did not occur in sequence. It occurred the way certain things occur, all at once, in layers, each one only comprehensible in retrospect. The Shadow Regent moved and the shadows moved with him, and Kaelin was between them before she had finished processing the motion. And the throne room became something that was not a room anymore, but a place where several centuries of accumulated consequence were attempting to resolve themselves simultaneously. Stone cracked along lines that had been stressed for 300 years. The carvings on the walls, the first crimson queens, the old seals, the recorded history of a dynasty that had been erased from every other surface, began to emit a light she had no color for, something between red and gold, ancient and not warm exactly, but alive. The pendant broke its chain. She did not feel it fall. She felt it rise, lifted from her sternum by something that had been suppressed inside it for 22 years, released now in the only moment it had ever been designed for. The magical aura her parents had hidden since her birth unfurled into the throne room like a held breath, finally let go, and the light from the carvings met it. And the throne at the far end of the dais responded to both. She walked toward it through the chaos, through shadow and shattered stone and the sounds of Kaelin holding the regent's attention with 5 centuries of his own considerable power. And she did not run, because running would have meant fear, and what she felt was not fear. It was the specific feeling of arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing it for her entire life. She placed her hands on the armrests. The throne did not wait for ceremony. It recognized her the way it had recognized her name in the stone, immediately, completely, without qualification. And the crimson magic that had been dormant since the dynasty's fall came back into the world all at once. Through her, from her, the birthmark above her heart, burning bright enough to be visible through the fabric of her dress. The royal seal of a bloodline that had never actually ended, announcing itself to a kingdom that had spent 3 centuries being told it was gone. The Shadow Regent turned toward her. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Kaelin did not give him the opportunity to recover. What ended the Shadow Regent was not violence precisely and not magic precisely, but something that required both the crimson power and 500 years of a king who had refused to stop believing the right answer existed, combined in the space of a throne room that had been built for exactly this and had been waiting with the particular patience of architecture. The shadows contracted. The layered voice cut off mid-syllable. The shadows pooled and thinned and were gone, and the room was left with the ringing silence of something that has been present for 3 centuries and has finally, completely stopped. The ancient seal did not need to be rebuilt. The Crimson Queen had simply replaced it. The aftermath was quieter than she expected. Most true endings are. Lady Morwen's crimes were laid before the kingdom's assembled noble houses in a proceeding that took 2 days and required very little argument, because the evidence was thorough and the witnesses were many, and Lady Morwen herself, for the first time in Lyra's memory, appeared to have run out of pleasant expressions to arrange over unpleasant realities. She lost her title in the first hour. Her wealth and properties followed by the end of the first day. She was escorted from Noctheris on the morning of the second with the specific and complete thoroughness of a woman who had built her entire life on a foundation she had stolen from someone else, and had now been required to give it back. Seraphine did not wait for the proceedings' conclusion. She left quietly the night before with a single traveling case and none of the jewels which Lyra thought said something about her that the jewels never had. She did not ask for anything. She did not look back. Lyra watched her carriage leave from an upper window and felt instead of the satisfaction she had perhaps been entitled to something more complicated and more honest. The recognition that Seraphine had been in her own way, as shaped by Lady Morwen's ambitions as Lyra had been. The difference was only in which direction the shaping had gone. She hoped, distantly, that Seraphine would find something real to want, something that belonged to her rather than to her mother's plans. Kaelin came to her the evening after it was over, when the palace had settled into the particular quiet of a place that has been the site of something significant and is now simply itself again. He came without ceremony, as he always did, and sat across from her in the way that had become, over weeks, entirely natural. He told her what he had not told her before. Not because he had been concealing it, but because there had always been something more urgent, and because some things require the right moment, and this was finally it. He said that he had known before the historian confirmed anything, before the pendant's aura was measured or the birthmark formally identified. Not because of prophecy, not because of bloodline, because she had thanked a frightened servant by name on her first morning in his palace, and crossed a room to comfort an attendant no one else had noticed was trembling, and treated everyone around her with the same careful dignity, regardless of whether they had anything to offer her in return. Because she had carried 4 years of deliberate cruelty without becoming cruel, because she had chosen every day in a house that gave her no reward for it to remain someone worth being. "I wasn't looking for a queen," he said. "I was looking for proof that the kingdom was worth saving. And you were it." He was quiet for a moment. "If you wish to leave this throne," he said, "I will leave it with you." She looked at him for a long time, at the man who had waited 5 centuries not for power but for hope, and had found it in someone who had spent 4 years being told she was nothing. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm staying." The coronation was held at midsummer in the great hall of the restored Crimson Palace. The foreign assembly that had never in living memory existed, vampires and humans standing in the same room, not from obligation or treaty, but from something that felt tentatively and genuinely like the beginning of a different kind of future. Blackthorn Palace was given to the kingdom's historical trust, its halls open to the public, its records corrected and its portraits restored. Lyra's mother's face returned to the walls where it had always belonged. The Crimson Dynasty was written back into history, standing in the throne room afterward. Her throne room, a fact she was still adjusting to with the patience it deserved. Lyra heard Lady Morwen's voice the way she occasionally still heard it, arriving without warning from the place where old wounds store their echoes. "No vampire king would ever choose you." She smiled. Not because the words had been proven wrong, though they had been, thoroughly and publicly and before the entire kingdom, but because she finally understood that they had never been about her at all. They had been about a frightened woman's need to diminish what she could not control, and a frightened woman's need has never been, in any world, a reliable measure of anyone's worth. The Vampire King had not made her worthy. He had simply been the first person in 4 years to see clearly. She had always been exactly this. She had simply, finally, stopped allowing anyone to tell her otherwise.